What's up, APUSH people? Today we're breaking down the historical time periods, trying to make sense of all these different periods in American history. We're going to focus on periods 6 to 9, roughly the 1860s, all the way to contemporary America. So we start off with the Gilded Age, and keep in mind this kind of doesn't have a start date officially, but we're going from around the 1870s to 1900. And in the Gilded Age, on the surface, everything appears to be really good and amazing. You have industrialization, but there's lots of problems beneath the surface. You have industrial revolution going on that really kind of kicks off with the Civil War in the 1860s, which you have rapid economic transformation of American society. People like Carnegie and Rockefeller building up industries in steel and oil. This is the rise of industrial capitalism, major industry, and you have manufacturing taking place at a much greater level than before. So manufacturing was replacing agriculture, and you have lots of technological changes going on. During the Industrial Revolution, you have migrations taking place. People are moving to urban areas. In fact, by 1920, you're going to have the majority of Americans living in cities, in urban areas. With these migrations, you have people coming into the United States, huge increase in immigration, and there's changes of who's coming to America. You have the rise of the new immigrants, especially in the 1890s, from Southern and Eastern European countries like Italy and Poland and Russia, and you have spikes in Asian immigration, especially from China. With this change in immigration, you're going to have nativism increasing during the Gilded Age, and you're going to see this manifest itself in things like the Chinese Exclusion Act in the 1880s and efforts to ban or limit immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. And you're going to see that in the 1920s with the quotas. Keep in mind during this time period, you have workers are organizing into national labor unions. And all those areas you see in the pink and the red stars are going to be places where strikes are going to take place. And various unions will form. You have the Knights of Labor. They focus on unskilled and skilled workers. They were much more welcoming to a variety of different types of workers, whereas the American Federation of Labor, headed by Samuel Gompers, was all about those skilled workers and bread and butter issues. So workers are responding to the problems of industrialization during this Gilded Age period. Farmers responded to mechanization of agriculture and control of the railroad industry as well. They're organizing and trying to fight back against some of these challenges. And the big movement is going to be in the 1890s, the People's Party, or more commonly referred to as the Populist Party. The farmers wanted a stronger government role in regulating the economic system. They want laws regulating railroad industry. They want the direct election of senators. They want free coinage of silver. And they're going to run your boy Thomas Watson for president. He's going to lose, but they're a major force, at least in the 1890s. So these are some of the big themes and events of the Gilded Age. Things look good, but underneath the surface, there's some challenges. The Industrial Revolution, a couple more things you should know about, is there is a common belief of laissez-faire. The government should not attempt to control or regulate business. This was advocated obviously by the wealthy, the business elite. They don't want government meddling in their pursuit of profits. Many advocated ideas such as social Darwinism, survival of the fittest, and this justified the concentration of wealth. The rich are getting richer because they're better, they deserve to be wealthy. They took Darwin's theories of evolution and applied them to the new industrial world. So make sure you know about social Darwinism. There are some examples of regulation. In this period, you have the beginnings of this. You have the Interstate Commerce Act in 1887, which regulated railroad rates. It was weak initially, but it's the beginning, and this is advocated by farmers. It's the beginning of government regulation of industry. You have the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. How are we going to regulate these monopolies, these trusts? And once again, in the beginning, very weak, but it is the beginning of government regulation. At the same time, in this period, in 1870s to 1890, you have something called the New South. There is industrialization of the South. People are advocating we should switch over to a more industrialized economy. In spite of this advocacy, sharecropping and tenant farming remain the primary economic activity throughout the southern states. And you are going to see post-Reconstruction, Jim Crow laws reinforced and deemed constitutional by the Plessy versus Ferguson decision throughout southern states. Now, during this same time, you're also having Western expansion take place. This is kind of a common theme in American history, but the Western expansion we're talking about in this time period, roughly the 1860s to 1890, is Trans-Mississippi West. You're going to have larger numbers of migrants move to the West in search of land and economic opportunity, frequently provoking competition and violent conflict. And this is actually going to be encouraged by the U.S. government, by the federal government. They are going to encourage this Western expansion. An example of this federal government role is the Homestead Act in 1862, where the government is giving free or cheap land to settlers to move out west. You have the Pacific Railroad Act in 1862, which allows for government the route of the first transcontinental railroad, and a huge part of this is government subsidies, tax breaks to the railroad companies to build this railroad network you see on those maps. Now, important to note, with this Western expansion comes the destruction and assault on native life, and this is going to take many different forms. You are going to have the rapid decline of the bison. It's going to be systematically slaughtered in order to undermine Native American resistance. You're going to have a series of Indian wars. You can see on the map those red stars are some of the biggies, and of course the last of the major Indian wars takes place at Wounded Knee in 1890. You're also going to have the Dawes Severalty Act passed by Congress in 1887, which effectively ended tribal ownership of land. The goal of the U.S. government was a policy of assimilation. Let's get Native Americans off of tribal land, off of communal land, and get them onto private property and Americanize them. That was one of the goals of the Dawes Act. Make sure you know about this guy, Frederick Jackson Turner, 1893, wrote The Significance of the Frontier in American History. He basically declared the frontier closed. You have the Indian Wars coming to a close. You have the continent settled from basically coast to coast. And this kind of idea of the frontier closing leads us to another period in American history, that of U.S. expansion. This is roughly 1890s to 1914. Now, I know what you're thinking. America has always been expanding since its little 13 colony days along the Atlantic coast. This is different. This is overseas expansion. One of the reasons this happens is this idea the frontier is closed in the 1890s, so the only place left to go is abroad, is overseas. There's other reasons as well you should know about. Economic, access to markets for goods and cheap raw materials. Remember, the Industrial Revolution is going on. How are we going to maintain this growth unless we find new markets and new cheap raw materials? You also have political motives for U.S. expansion. We want to compete with other nations, especially European nations, and also the rise of Japan around the globe. There's military reasons as well. People like Alfred T. Mahan advocated for building up a strong navy, so you're going to need islands for naval bases across the globe. And then finally, there's also ideological reasons. This idea of spreading Anglo-Saxon civilization, spreading democracy, spreading Christianity. There's a variety of forms this takes, but all of these different things, including the closing of the frontier, contributes to American expansion in the 1890s. Lots of examples you should know about. You have the annexation of Hawaii, and remember, Hawaii geographically is going to be significant, strategically significant, but there's also economic motives for its annexation by William McKinley. You have in China the open door policy, wanting access to trade, getting rid of European and Japanese spheres of influence. You have the Spanish-American War, hugely important in 1898. The Splendid Little War, 4 months. We fight Spain, and we end up annexing not only Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. And you can see on the map some of those territories. This is followed by a brutal war against the Philippines led by the Filipino resistance by Emilio Aguinaldo. They don't want the U.S. to take them over, and the Philippines fights back, and it's a deadly, brutal war. And of course, you have Theodore Roosevelt with his big project, the Big Panama Canal, and he adds his Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, saying that we are going to be the policeman, the regulators of the Western Hemisphere. Keep in mind, not everyone agrees with this. You have debates between imperialists, those in favor of expansion, and the Anti-Imperialist League, who are opposed to this expansion and criticize U.S. efforts abroad. Make sure you know that This expansion takes place during the administrations of not only McKinley, Roosevelt, but also William Howard Taft and Woodrow Wilson. They're going to play a more active role. They're going to do so in a variety of ways. So know some examples of U.S. expansion during these years. Which leads us to our next period in American history, the Progressive Movement, which really kind of begins in the 1890s to roughly 1920. This is happening at the same time some of these other events are going on, but this is really a domestic movement. It's government power to regulate and improve society. There was a belief that there were numerous problems that needed to be addressed, and this was a rejection of the laissez-faire ideology. The government needs to play a role. You have various muckrakers who start exposing problems. You have various movements that are happening. And ultimately, this movement, the Progressive Movement, is going to result in reform. Some economic examples is trust busting under Theodore Roosevelt and Taft and Wilson. They're going to start strengthening the Sherman Antitrust Act and breaking up the so-called bad trust. You're going to have the Meat Inspection Act regulating the meat industry, Pure Food and Drug Act regulating both the drug and food industry, and the Wisconsin idea, right, by Robert Lafayette, where we're going to regulate the railroad industry and other big business. There's also going to be efforts to expand democracy during the Progressive Movement. And that's you're going to see in the 17th Amendment, providing for the direct election of senators, and reforms like the recall, the initiative, the direct primary, and of course a very active women's suffrage movement that had been going on for quite some time and picks up steam during the 1890s and the early 20th century. Now keep in mind the Progressive Movement is a variety of movements, so not everyone who fought for women's suffrage is fighting for these other areas. Women are going to play a huge role in the Progressive Movement, especially middle-class white women, and especially in cities. Whereas the populist movement was farmers, the progressives are urban city dwellers. You're also going to have moral reform during the Progressive Movement. There was the Anti-Saloon League, which advocated prohibition, and eventually they will get passage of the 18th Amendment banning alcohol. And, of course, the environmental movement. And you're going to have various branches of that environmental movement. The preservationists who wanted to keep nature pure, led by John Muir, and the conservationists, led by Theodore Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot, where we're going to kind of manage natural resources for future generations. Once again, the Progressive Movement is going to span various presidential administrations, so not only is Theodore Roosevelt, but Taft and Wilson are all going to seek reform at the national level. They're going to have various degrees of success, and as you're going to see with Woodrow Wilson, they're reluctant to support certain reforms such as women's suffrage, and women have to put a lot of pressure on him to finally achieve that 19th Amendment. World War I kind of interrupts this domestic reform movement. The Progressive era really begins in 1914 and will go until 1918. Make sure you know that in the beginning, the U.S. was pledged to neutrality. Wilson tried to keep the United States out of World War I, but we will ultimately enter the war in 1917 for a variety of reasons. One is kind of ideological. Wilson wanted to be involved in the post-war negotiations. He wanted to make the world safe for democracy, and so he wants to be at the table when the treaties are signed. You have violations of American neutrality. Remember the sinking of the Lusitania, the British ship. American lives are lost. You have the Zimmerman telegram, where Germany is trying to hook up with Mexico and declare war against the United States. And you have the fact that we were giving a lot of money to the Allies, and so we had an economic stake in their victory. We do go to war, and eventually the U.S. helps win that war, and Wilson is going to be heavily involved in post-war negotiations. Make sure you know about the 14 points, his kind of plan for the future, and his plan to try to prevent future wars, and a big part of that is the League of Nations, this international organization that will prevent future wars from occurring. Ultimately, though, Congress rejects the League of Nations. The Republican-controlled Congress had no desire to kind of move away from George Washington's warnings in his farewell address, and so they say, we're staying out of this. And this kind of, for a lot of people, marks a return to U.S. isolationism. We want to stay out of European affairs or only be involved when we want to be involved. The impact on the home front during World War I, there's a couple important things that you should highlight. One is the Great Migration. There's a huge movement of African Americans from the South to northern cities like New York that happens actually before World War I, but World War I accelerates it. And then, of course, you have violations of civil liberties. You have the Sedition Act, which basically really placed a lot of restrictions on freedom of the speech, and the Schenck versus the U.S. case, which says speech can be restricted as long as that speech presents a clear and present danger. So you have this theme again of civil liberties and security and the balance between those two. When World War I ends, the progressive movement kind of peters out, and you have this period that everyone loves to study, the Roaring Twenties. And the Roaring Twenties has tremendous economic and cultural changes. It's a decade of lots of transformations. You have new technologies like the radio, car, and others that are becoming affordable or invented for the first time, and this dramatically improves the standard of living for a lot of Americans. Not only that, you have mass consumption because people are able to buy things using new forms of payment like the installment plan, and advertising and the growth of the advertising industry allows people to kind of realize they want a bunch of things that they may not be able to afford. Now, another part of the 1920s you definitely need to know about are the conflicts. A lot of different conflicts. You have conflicts between native-born Americans and immigrants. Remember, there's that reaction to those Southern and Eastern European immigrants. In fact, right after World War I, you're going to have something called the Red Scare, where everyone's freaking out that America's going to have a revolution and we're going to be overrun by Bolsheviks and communists and anarchists and all these things. And the Palmer Raid starts rounding up people, whether or not they actually did anything wrong or not. You have the famous Sacco and Vanzetti trial, where those dudes don't get any kind of fair trial because they're Italian, they're anarchists, they're draft dodgers, and they're ultimately put to death. You have the quota acts that are passed. The big one is in 1924 that basically says only 2% of the immigrants that came in 1890 could come, and that was intended to restrict and limit immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. Another conflict you see is conflict between religious fundamentalists who tended to be in rural areas and more modern thinking that tended to be in the cities. This manifests itself in all sorts of areas like the Scopes trial, where a teacher gets in trouble for teaching evolution. You have the 18th Amendment, which is not just an issue over religion, but many religious fundamentalists favored banning alcohol. And that doesn't go all that well as you see a rise in crime and people like Al Capone. And then there's all sorts of other conflicts that you should kind of make yourself aware, such as the rise of the KKK that's connected to this anti-immigrant rise of nativism. You get the Lost Generation, a whole group of writers and artists who are disillusioned with the consumerism of the 1920s and the other things going on. And you get the Harlem Renaissance and this flowering of black culture and a celebration of being black in America. So the Roaring Twenties, much more complicated decade than just flappers and drinking illegal alcohol. Which leads us to the Great Depression. Great Depression begins in 1929. Throughout the decade of the 1920s, the stock market was doing really well, and all of that collapses on October 29, 1929, Black Tuesday. This is the start of the Great Depression. And there's a lot of reasons for the Great Depression. The stock market is just one of those reasons. Hoover tries to figure out what to do, doesn't do enough, and loses the election to Franklin Roosevelt. And in 1933, he takes office, and this is kind of the period of the New Deal. Franklin Roosevelt, FDR, believed in his New Deal program, which he felt was going to provide relief, recovery, and reform for the American people. This changed the role of the federal government and created the modern welfare state. And they love to ask questions that compare and contrast the New Deal to the progressive movement. They share something in common, which is a rejection of laissez-faire. Couple things that you should know, some programs. FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, insured people's bank deposits, still around today. The Social Security Administration provided basically the modern day safety net, the welfare state, protecting the elderly, the unemployed, and women with dependent children. You have the Wagner Act in 1935, which basically for the first time the federal government is saying, labor unions have a right to exist, and the federal government is going to stand behind their right to bargain collectively. There is debate over the New Deal. You know, there were people who wanted to limit it or kind of roll it back. The Supreme Court declares a couple New Deal programs unconstitutional, the NRA and the AAA. Roosevelt tries his court-packing plan and suffers a rare political defeat. Republicans and conservatives did not like the New Deal because they did not like this rise of liberalism, this big government. And you had others who wanted to expand the New Deal, people like Huey Long, who wanted to kind of adopt kind of a socialist plan, every man a king, share our wealth. He's going to get shot, so that's not going to work out. But there were debates about the New Deal. Keep in mind, the impact is huge. There is a New Deal Democratic coalition as a group such as farmers, urban immigrants, union members, African Americans, and women start really voting for the Democratic Party in huge numbers because of the New Deal policies under Franklin Roosevelt. It established the federal responsibility for society, this idea of the safety net. This was not established in America until the New Deal. It is the beginning or the rise of liberalism during this time period, represented by the Democratic Party. But keep in mind, the New Deal does not end the Great Depression. It will ultimately be World War II, which does that. This kind of period ends in around 1939 as the world's attention and the nation's attention turns to World War II, which is going to take place from 1939 to 1945. In the beginning, from 1939 to 1941, we're basically trying to stay the heck out of it, just as we did during World War I. There's a whole bunch of things that slowly kind of get us more and more involved. You have the Neutrality Acts, where we're like not selling weapons to any country at war. We're not sailing on boats. But then England's in trouble, as you can see in that political cartoon. So we start adopting policies like cash carry, Lend-Lease. We're slowly helping out the Allies because we don't want them to lose to these totalitarian governments. Well, neutrality will end with the attack on Pearl Harbor by Japan on December 7th, 1941. We are now in World War II. The impact of World War II on the home front is huge. Make sure you know about it. The biggie is Japanese American and Japanese internment, basically civil liberties denied. Japanese people of Japanese descent, over 100,000, are sent to one of 10 internment camps throughout the country. This is a huge violation of their civil liberties and an embarrassment for America and American history. There's a mass mobilization during World War II. All parts of society are mobilizing to help win the war, U.S. factories, labor unions, and so on. And you have all sorts of social impacts of the war. You have the Double V campaign for African Americans, victory against tyranny abroad, as well as victory against racism at home. You have women playing an active role symbolized by Rosie the Riveter, and you have something called the Bracero program, where Mexicans are brought into the United States to work to cover the labor shortage in areas especially like agriculture. So know about the impacts of World War II on the home front. Eventually, of course, the Allies will win. We roll deep, but of course the big ones were the Soviets, the United States, and England. And there's a variety of reasons. One is U.S. industrial production. We produce a huge amount of the weapons and the stuff that helps fight the Axis powers, and you get new technology. And of course the big one is the Manhattan Project, the secret program between England and the US that develops the A-bomb, which will ultimately end World War II, and the importance of the Big Three alliance, Churchill, Stalin, and FDR, and their relationship and collaboration will help bring down the Axis powers. And important battles, military success at places like D-Day, Normandy in northern France, the opening of the Second Front, and island hopping, where basically the United States is trying to get close enough to Japan to either invade or bomb the country. Ultimately, it will be the atomic bomb, which will end World War II. Hugely debated topic, different opinions on that issue. I highly suggest you kind of develop your own opinion, but with the end of World War II, big idea, America becomes a superpower. We emerge as one of the most dominant countries in the world. And that leads us to our next period, the Cold War. There is no start date on the Cold War. It's going to go from 1945-ish to 1981. And basically the Cold War is an ideological, political, and military struggle between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. It really starts to pick up some steam in 1947, And the U.S. objective throughout the Cold War is contain communism. Communism was already in Eastern Europe. We were not liking that. Remember the Yalta Agreement? We thought Stalin was going to remove those troops. He does not. And a guy by the name of George Kennan comes up with this containment policy. There are numerous examples of containment. Here are a few. The Truman Doctrine. We're going to give money to Greece and Turkey to make sure they don't fall to the communists, and they do not. The Marshall Plan. We're going to give a lot of money to Western Europe to help rebuild it so that those countries will not turn to communism. They do not. You're going to have NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is an example of collective security. All those countries in the green belong to NATO. That is our first permanent military alliance, and it is going to still be around to this day. Other examples of containment get a little messier. In Korea, we stopped the North Korean advance on South Korea, therefore preserving South Korea's non-communist status. And we tried to stop communism in Vietnam, but it's a little messy there because it's really kind of a mix of communism and a nationalist movement. They wanted to get rid of France, and then they wanted to get rid of us, and ultimately the U.S. is not going to do as well in Vietnam. The U.S. and the Soviets fluctuated between periods of confrontation. We got beef all over the globe, but we're also going to have periods of détente or mutual coexistence or relaxation of tensions. Some examples of conflict: you have the Berlin blockade, where Truman stands up to Stalin with the Berlin airlift. The Cuban Missile Crisis, the whole world nearly ended. Luckily, Kennedy and Khrushchev, cooler heads prevailed. But you're going to have these examples throughout the Cold War of us kind of thawing or tensions relaxing. Spirit of Geneva under Eisenhower, where we're starting to talk to one another. The SALT I treaty with the Soviet Union under Nixon, and of course Nixon being the guy who opens up our relationship with China in the 1970s. A few more things about the Cold War you should know about. During the Cold War, the U.S. is going to, at times, support for undemocratic governments. For example, the CIA is going to overthrow or help overthrow the government in Iran and Guatemala in the 1950s under Eisenhower. And in both cases, new governments that take the place of the government we help get rid of are not exactly friendly to the local population or democratic. We support them, though, because they are non-communist and they're our buds. You're going to see this support for undemocratic governments also in South Vietnam, as both Eisenhower and Kennedy supported the Diem administration in spite of its corruption and lack of support from the general population. Another important idea during the Cold War is this kind of battle between civil liberties versus security. There is a fear during the Cold War that takes place. In fact, there's a second Red Scare in the late 40s, early 1950s, and this manifests itself in the House of Un-American Activities Committee, where they start investigating communist influence and the rise of Senator Joseph McCarthy and McCarthyism. There were, in fact, some communist spies. You have Alger Hiss and the Rosenbergs, but this fear kind of becomes a paranoia, and a lot of people's civil liberties are violated in the process. There is a debate over the arms race. We are competing with the Soviet Union, who can build up a bigger arsenal, and famously Eisenhower in his farewell address warns the nation about the military-industrial complex, and there is conscious fear of this proliferation of these horrible weapons, and you're going to see arms control agreements taking place, or at least attempted, throughout the Cold War. The Cold War is going to lead to some controversies. You're going to have famously the anti-war protest over the war in Vietnam, and this is going to pick up a huge amount after the Tet Offensive in 1968, where people realize this war is nowhere near being over, and following revelations of the secret bombing of Cambodia by the Nixon administration, and ultimately this will one of these protests will end in a shooting at the university, Kent State University. More protests will erupt following revelations of the secret bombing of Cambodia by the Nixon administration. And during this wave of protest, you have the shooting that takes place at Kent State, where people are shot by the National Guard. Quick look at some of the domestic things happening. The 1950s is oftentimes kind of seen as this decade of conservative or complacent. There's a lot of opportunity to compare it to the 1920s because you got a lot of things that are similar. Eisenhower's the president, the hero of World War II. He is a moderate Republican, so you're not going to see a big reform. There's no liberal huge agenda going on, but there's a lot of changes in America. It's an economically prosperous decade, relatively speaking, for many people, but not all people. And you're going to see the growth of the middle class, post-World War II economy, a huge growth in the middle class as the economy is transitioning. You got more and more white-collar workers, so people are not working in industrial factories, but in more white-collar type jobs. Post-World War II, you also have this mass movement of people to the suburbs, the famous levee towns, and you have a huge baby boom in the late 40s and early 50s. Credit cards are introduced in this decade, which allows for an increase in consumerism. Television became a common household item in the 1950s and kind of leads to the spread and growth of American culture. But there are tensions in the 1950s that you should be aware of, and these are some of them. And Betty Friedan writes The Feminine Mystique. It's actually published in 1960, but it really kind of condemns the way women are treated in American society and the expectations of women playing the role of the happy suburban housewife. And you're going to see the growth of the women's movement in subsequent years. The Beatniks, a group of artists, criticized the conformity of the 1950s. And of course, a big example of this decade not being one filled with complacency comes with the civil rights movement that really picks up a lot of energy in the 1950s. So let's take a quick look at the civil rights movement. There's no start date for this, but civil rights activists used legal challenges, nonviolence, and direct action to achieve their goals and to try to overturn the Jim Crow system that was in place, as you could see in that photo. There is no START movement. World War II, you see with the Double Victory campaign, you have organizations like CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, starting to rise up. And in the 1950s, in 1954, you have Brown v. Board of Education. This overturns segregation, rules school segregation inherently unequal. Other examples of nonviolence and direct action can be seen in the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955, sparked by the arrest of Rosa Parks, the Freedom Rides in 1961 during the Kennedy administration. And so this movement really kind of is energized in World War II, picks up steam in the 50s, and then explodes in the 1960s. An important idea you should keep in mind is the three branches of the government eventually played a role in advancing the cause of civil rights. At first, they're slow to do so, but with a lot of pressure, eventually we start to see some change. An executive branch role in that change can be seen when Truman desegregated the military in 1948, took a lot of heat for that. Judicial change can be seen with Brown v. Board of Education, which overturned Plessy v. Ferguson. And legislative change can be seen with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. We'll cover both those in just a few moments, signed by President Lyndon Johnson. Civil rights movements, there's a lot more movements than just African American civil rights, but keep in mind there was fierce white resistance to these changes, especially in southern states. You have the Southern Manifesto to the Brown decision, where over 100 southern congressmen basically said the Supreme Court is abusing its power. You have the Little Rock Nine, blocked by Governor Orville Faubus. He doesn't want to allow them into the schools. And as this resistance takes place, there are debates over the tactics and the philosophies amongst civil rights leaders. They start to question what is the best path to achieve their goals. So you start to get more radical voices in the civil rights movements. People like Stokely Carmichael, associated with the Black Power movement, Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam, and the Black Panthers out in Oakland. They start to kind of be known as the Black Radicalism, the Black Power movement, who call for much more aggressive action. There are other civil rights movements which are inspired by the African American civil rights movements. You have women taking on more vocal opposition, kind of sparked with the Feminine Mystiques publication, and then you get people like Betty Friedan forming organizations such as the National Organization for Women. You have the American Indian Movement and Latinos such as Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers Union, and the rise of the gay rights movement with the Stonewall riots in 1969. So make sure you know about the variety of civil rights movements taking place, and especially how they played a role in the 1960s. And you can't talk about the 1960s without talking about Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. This is really seen as the height of liberalism, and the Great Society dramatically increased the size and the scope of the federal government. In many ways, the Great Society is a continuation of the New Deal programs, but whereas the New Deal was primarily focused with ending the Great Depression, the Great Society is going to go much further. It was this idea, this liberal idea, that government power can be used to fix societal problems. And you're going to see a variety of programs like Medicare. Those over 65 could get health care, Medicaid, health care for the poor and disabled, Job Corps, vocational education. A big act you should know about, the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, which basically wipes out those quotas from the 1920s, which allows for people, especially people from Latin America and Asia, to come into the United States in much greater numbers. The two other big ones are the Civil Rights Acts. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, which basically declared segregation illegal in all public facilities, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which basically wiped out all of those things that were used to prevent African Americans from voting in the South, such as the literacy test. So, whereas the New Deal kind of ignored or overlooked race relations, the Great Society made it a huge focus of its platform. During this time, you also have Earl Warren, the Warren Supreme Court, which are going to rule on a variety of cases, which are going to expand it, democracy and individual liberty. There is, of course, a conservative reaction. You could see that really in the election of 1964 with Barry Goldwater, even though he gets his butt kicked against Lyndon Johnson. And conservatives criticize the Great Society and other liberal programs as too costly, inefficient, too idealistic. They created dependency on people, and so they were very vocal. Barry Goldwater kind of begins this modern conservative movement. He loses the election, but that movement continues into the late 60s. You get Nixon winning in 1968, and although he's not a hardcore social conservative, Nixon wins, a Republican, in 68, and you're going to see the conservative movement grow in the 70s and eventually in the 80s. Which leads us to the 70s. Few things you should know about. There is a huge distrust of the government in the 1970s, and there's a lot of reasons for it. You know, the failures of the Vietnam War, like did we actually get attacked at the Gulf of Tonkin? Why did they say the war is almost over and then the Tet Offensive happened? Why is Nixon bombing Cambodia? And the revelation of some of these things in the Pentagon Papers makes a lot of individuals distrust the federal government. The Watergate scandal fuels that fire of government distrust, where Nixon is found to be doing some things that are not exactly on the up and up, and he is ultimately forced to resign, and Gerald Ford becomes the first unelected president in our nation's history. You have the Iran hostage crisis and Jimmy Carter's inability to handle that effectively. All of these things and others lead to a distrust of the government. And of course, in the 70s, there is an economic slowdown. You have something called stagnation and high inflation, which becomes known as stagflation. So the economy is kind of sputtering forward in the 1970s, which leads to a lot of unhappiness, and that leads us to the 1980s and the rise of the conservative movement. There's a lot of reasons for it. You have the rise of the religious fundamentalists who are worried about all these social changes, the rise of feminism, the legalization of abortion, and religious fundamentalists start to organize. You got a lack of faith in government, which we just mentioned. And then you got economic concerns. They start rejecting Conservatives reject the deficits of the New Deal and the Great Society and other liberal programs. They don't trust the government to solve society's problems. And Reagan kind of rides this conservative movement to election in 1980. There are some conservative victories under Reagan. He does initiate tax cuts, especially for the wealthy, this idea of trickle-down economics, Reaganomics. There is the continued deregulation of many industries, and entitlement spending is decreased. Things on like welfare and food stamps, those programs are cut in the 80s. There are limits to the conservative movement you should know about. Programs such as Social Security from the New Deal days and Medicare during the Great Society, they remain. They were popular with voters, and nobody, Republican or Democrat, want to mess with them because the voters will be angry. And in spite of all this kind of criticism of big government, the government remained big under Reagan because of defense spending and tax cuts, so you have a huge federal deficit in the 80s. Some foreign policy stuff you should know, and we're almost done. Remember, the Cold War ends in 1991. The Soviet Union basically falls apart. A lot of reasons for that. And the post-Cold War foreign policy environment is going to probably be even more complicated than the days of the big Soviet boogeyman being out there. And that is really kind of marked by the terrorist attacks on 9/11 in 2001. This begins the war on terror. Following the attacks on 9/11, you have a war that takes place in Afghanistan, you have a war in Iraq, and this has also impacts on the home front. Congress passes the Patriot Act signed by President George Bush, and once again you have debates over the impact on civil liberties. How far should we go to investigate potential terrorist attacks? Alright, APUSH friends, I try to make it quick, but I know that's a lot of information. There's a ton of review videos on the channel. Check them out. Check out our period 6 through 9 review videos. Check out the website, APUSHexplained.com. It's the hottest site on earth. Tons of chapter review videos, all sorts of review sheets, key concepts. And if you haven't already done so, subscribe to Jocz Productions. Good luck on your test in May. You're going to rock it. Remember, take the test. Don't let the test take you. If you would do me a solid, pay it forward until next year's APUSH crew. Check out Jocz Productions and APUSHexplained.com. Thank you for watching. Have a beautiful day. Peace.